Keynote speech by Volker Bach.
All right, so yes, I'm glad to see so many of you here, and very happy to be today presenting my new book, which it's something I didn't say I think I would be saying anytime soon, but yes, it's here. It's called the Landsknecht Cookbook, and it's taking us to the other side of the most vicious wars of the 16th century, from the Ottoman Empire to the Holy Roman Empire, and specifically its soldiers. Now, before I start my presentation, there are two things I would like to say. Number one, yes, I'm immensely proud of this book, and I'm going to be talking about how wonderful it is. I'm also going to be talking about some of the aspects of it that are not so wonderful, because this is the first time I'm working with a German publisher of mass market books, and there are aspects to that that did not make me entirely happy. But please don't take this as me putting any kind of pressure on you to actually buy the book. If you like it, I'll be very, very happy for you to get it, of course, but I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable mixing academic interest and sales talk. The other thing is, if you have any questions at any point during my talk, please feel free to raise them at that point. That's much easier than trying to remember them to the very end. And my talk is reasonably flexible, so we can usually put in any smaller question right there and then. Okay. Now, let me begin. I hope you can all see this.
Wonderful. We can see your screen, yes.
All right, wonderful. So welcome to my introduction to the Landsknecht Cookbook, 16th century military cuisine from the Holy Roman Empire. This is actually an English translation of this. This is the German version. It came out last year. So this is a book that actually first came out in German, and that I managed to convince the publisher had enough potential to go for their first ever English language publication, because Zauberfeder is actually a reasonably big name in the German reenactment and fantasy role-playing scene, but they have never done anything up to now on the international scale. This is their first English language book, and if this works out, they might do more, which is nice, because their books actually have some lovely appeal. So here we go, the Landsknecht Cookbook and how we got here. This book has a medical history, as it were. I started serious research into Landsknecht food in 2010 after I was recovering from major surgery while I was stuck at home, not allowed to go anywhere and not able to work. And a friend of mine who does Landsknecht reenactment asked me if I could look into some recipes for him. So I started looking. And you know how these things go. I mean, you can start looking at something like that, but it's kind of difficult to stop looking once you've started, and that's exactly what happened. It ended up taking me down a rabbit hole, and the manuscript that I had prepared at that point, I've still got it on my hard drive. It's about 200 odd pages of historical background, recipes, and all kinds of stuff on the Landsknecht armies. And I'm still debating whether to expand something of that into a Landsknecht life in the field book or something like that. But that is the first thing. That is how it got started. And then, due to great good fortune and the good luck of meeting the series editor at the Oxford Symposium on Food and Cookery, I was able to get turned some of that research into a book of its own, The Kitchen, Food and Cooking in Reformation Germany, that came out in 2016. I am very, very proud of that book. It contains everything that I wanted to see in a book other than redacted recipes, which there aren't any in there, which I thought was a pity. But it is ridiculously expensive because it is an academic book. I don't think I want to do another one of that because I mean, you may have looked at it. Some of you may actually own that book. If you do, I apologize. I had no say in the pricing. I pointed out to the publisher several times that $80 is too much. But anyway, if you do not own that book, try to get it by an interlibrary loan. It is worth it. Then in 2019, in one of my English classes, I met somebody who was the sister of the wife of the owner of Zauberfeder Verlag. Because apparently that is how you get book contracts. It's not like I haven't been trying with other publishers in the meantime, but apparently that is how it works. And in 2019, I got the contract for the German version we appear with Zauberfeder. And that was just perfectly timed because in the following year, I had a lot of free time on my hands while I was sitting in lockdown. And the book got finished reasonably quickly. And then the publisher nearly went bankrupt and only managed to survive by dint of government subsidies, which was very fortuitous. And in 2021, we published the German version and commissioned the English translation the very next day, which surprised me a little bit, but made me very happy. And that English translation is what we'll be looking at. So, first question, why Landsknecht? Well, partly, of course, because I was asked by somebody who does Landsknecht, but that just moves the question on. It's like the question about life on Earth being created by aliens. So where do the aliens come from? Why does this guy want to do Landsknecht? Why do so many people want to do Landsknechts? And I think one of the reasons is Landsknechts just had style. They were visually loud. They were probably also physically loud. We don't have any recordings, but it matches their style. If you look at the picture of those two guys, those two gentlemen are the epitome of what we consider Landsknechtisch. They are heavily armed, they are heavily bearded, they are very proudly strutting. And if you look at their hats, those ostrich feathers on there, each single one of those ostrich feathers probably costs as much as a laborer makes in a day or two. If you look at the clothes, especially of the man on the right, the one on the left has a mail shirt, which kind of ruins the effect. But if you imagine the clothes of the man on the right, slashed and puffed in bright, contrasting colors, then you've got the very image of a Landsknecht. In fact, this was, at the time I put this together, the very first image that appeared on the Wikipedia page when you looked for a Landsknecht, which is why I picked it, because number one, it's iconic. It comes up first or second in any Google search on the topic. And number two, it's actually open source, so I can leave this presentation up and don't have to worry about copyright violations. There is a small problem with this, and I'm going to let you in on the secret right now before anybody else points it out. These are not actually Landsknechts. These are Swiss foot soldiers, the people that the Landsknechts aspire to be like. But the style is so similar that it really is only based on very, very small details that you can tell that they are not Landsknecht, that they are Swiss. The Landsknechts were copying the Swiss, and the Swiss were, at the time, the most fearsome infantry force in Western Europe. A little bit of history just on the side, because we have a few minutes for this. At the end of the 15th century, when Burgundy was a very serious power in Western Europe and threatened to dominate both the Holy Roman Empire and France, the Duke of Burgundy, Charles the Bold, I think in the Irish sense, declared war, among others, on the Swiss. He fought 3 battles. In his first battle, he lost his entire treasury, which means that if you want to see what the court of Charles the Bold looked like, what courtly luxury in late 15th century Europe looked like, the court of Burgundy, which everybody in France, in Britain, in Germany, in the Low Countries, in Scandinavia, everybody got their idea of luxury from. You have to go to Switzerland, because that's where all the stuff is. Number 2, on the second battle, he was again soundly defeated, got away with his life, scraped together another army, went to war again, and died. That's the Swiss. The Swiss infantry was they were the most coveted mercenaries in all of Europe, and they were expensive. And if there is one thing you know about the Holy Roman emperors of the 15th and 16th century, it's that they're broke. The Holy Roman Emperor is a position of great honor, but it comes with practically no income. The Holy Roman emperors, except for Charles V, very briefly, were effectively never able to command a full treasury. So hiring Swiss infantry was right out. Also, they were at war with the Swiss. So they needed their own infantry, and they formed the Landsknecht. And how exactly that happened is, well, let's just say we've been debating this for, at the very least, 2 centuries, and we're still not really sure. But they managed to put together a very serious infantry force, and these Landsknechte, they performed well on the battlefield. They won a large number of battles for the Holy Roman Empire and its enemies. One of the most iconic songs about Landsknecht life, which I will reference a little bit later, is about how wonderful it is to be serving the king instead of the farmer. Because if you work for the farmer, you wear coarse linens and scratchy shirts and you eat sour milk. But if you work for the king, you get to wear wonderfully colorful, bright clothing, silk and fine linens, and you get to carry bottles of wine. And that is all very fascinating. And it sounds eminently patriotic until you realize that the king they're talking about is Francis I of France, the enemy of the Holy Roman Empire, because the Landsknechts did not particularly care who they served as long as they got paid. The Landsknechts were very well known for a number of things, including heavy drinking and demanding eating. The heavy drinking was something that, it basically, you did not need saying. If you had Landsknechts around, there would be heavy drinking. There is a 1520 series of woodcuts with Landsknechts, invented Landsknecht characters. It's like one of those quartet games. You have the Fähnrich, you have the Feldweibel, you have the Hauptmann, and you have all 4 officers together. And they were given names and poems and background stories. And most of the common soldiers were given names that either spoke to their reputation for bravery or for alcoholism. Those things went hand in hand. The other thing, that they were demanding eaters, and that is specific. I don't think you're going to find any 16th century military west of the Ottoman Empire that does not have a reputation as drunkards. But even the Swiss, habitual enemies of the Landsknechts, there was a fascinating relationship. The Landsknechts wanted to be exactly like the Swiss, only better, because they had this terrible jealousy of them. The Swiss had a very well organized, centralized food supply system, where they dished out rations and they cooked them in a centralized system. The Landsknechts did none of these things. And when the army of the Holy Roman Empire lost a battle against the Swiss in 1498, the Swiss, who had stormed the imperial camp in the late evening when they were all just sitting down for dinner, actually made a joke about that. A song, a poem, which survives to this day, which goes that in the camp of the Landsknechts, they were cooking and roasting, and the pots were bubbling over. And when they'd all sat down to dinner, we cleared out the kitchen. That's the stereotype of the Landsknecht. That's something that the Swiss do not share. Okay, innovation in warfare. They were innovative. They were not the only innovation in warfare. That was something that was happening all over the place. It's called the military revolution. But the Landsknechts were innovative. They came up with all kinds of interesting things. And I'm just now reading again through a book by a military theorist of the time. They were very well organized in theory. In practice, it looks different. And if you have any questions about the difference between the theoretical capabilities of a military and the practical capabilities of a military, I refer you to the evening news out of Ukraine. The Landsknechts were in theory eminently capable. In practice, sometimes they weren't. We will get to some of the details here, but the biggest thing about them, and I was really surprised to learn that the Landsknechts were really a media phenomenon. German print media, German poetry, German songs of the 16th century, especially the early 16th century, are full of them. And we used to think that's because they are so important, but that's not really the case. It's because the print media so loved them, and it's because the Landsknechts themselves, as a group, were really formed by print media. If you wanted to be a Landsknecht and you went to join a Landsknecht army, you knew how to be that largely from what you had heard and read about them. It's a self-perpetuating stereotype, and it took a lot to break it. Okay, but what we will be talking about in the first part today is how to feed Landsknecht armies. Part of this is from my research, and part of this you will find in the book itself. This is not a Landsknecht army, but this is from the time when the Landsknechts became a serious force. This actually was observed at the Council of Constance, where foreign bakers, foreign in this case meaning not from the town of Constance, so it could come from anywhere. Some people have theorized they're Italians. I don't think they carried that thing across the Alps. Anyway, brought mobile ovens to sell large quantities of pastries to the members, participants in the Council of Constance. Council of Constance, just very briefly, took care of the Great Schism and restored the papacy to a single holder, and that was one of the biggest events in European history, just preceding the Reformation, ecclesiastically speaking. It was politically very important that it concentrated an enormous amount of wealth and influence in the town of Constance for a short period of time, which meant that there was huge amounts of money to be made. The point that I'm trying to make here is that there is a large amount of inventiveness and a large amount of flexibility in the food system if you have the right kind of money. And that's exactly what the Landsknecht had. A Landsknecht soldier, and that guy, by the way, is a Landsknecht soldier. What you're seeing here is the basic self-contained unit of the Landsknecht army. The basic self-contained unit of a modern army is the division. The division brings to the field its own supply train, its own supply services, its own health services, its own artillery, and its own logistics. This is the smallest self-contained unit of the Landsknecht army, the Landsknecht and his wife, or common law wife. In the front, you see the combat arm. In the back, you see the logistics. That's her job. That is how Landsknecht armies were set up. A Landsknecht soldier served on an individual contract basis. He would be hired by the month, and his employer would be responsible for pay. That was it. There's a fixed rate of pay. It stays invariant through the 16th century, which incidentally means it devalues over time because the pay is set in silver, and silver devalues over the course of the 16th century. The pay is 4 Rhenish guilders a month. 4 Rhenish guilders a month is a lot of money. These were highly paid troops. But that covered what the diet of Worms calls Sold, Kost und Schaden. That makes the soldier responsible for pay, for supplying himself, and for the upkeep of his equipment. All of that needs to come from that money. Handgunners get an extra guilder because they have an expenditure in powder that the regular soldiers who use bladed weapons do not. There's an enormous concern with fairness and balance in this system, and the details we're not going to get into, but it's right there. The soldiers, therefore, needed to get food from somewhere. And private suppliers were invited to sell goods at organized camp markets. The theory is utterly neoliberal. The individual soldier contracts with an individual supplier for an individual supply of food, usually sold in single portions. It never worked that way, but it's an idea. It's a theory. This is from Franzberger's book, the one I'm rereading, and I'm afraid all you can see here really is that a lot of stuff is going on. But this is a Landsknecht camp. Let me just see here. I can get you a spotlight. Out here, you can see the artillery. This is the side that they expect the enemy to come from. Oops, sorry. That they expect the enemy to come from. At the center of the camp, you can see the command tents here and the market and assembly square here. And this here, these are huts of cellars. This is the artillery camp. They have the powder in here, so they have extra security cordon around it. And their own market. Artillery gets its own market. Here you have the pikes of the soldiers, then the individual soldiers' tents. These are much, much prettier than they ever were in reality. Over here's the gallows, just as a reminder that everybody to behave. And yeah, here's the market square. The camp has a market. It's a very well organized thing in theory. In practice, not so much.
The question is what Franzberger book this came from exactly?
This one comes from something that is called Das Kriegsbuch, which is basically a re-edition of his 5 Bücher über die Kriegskunst. Let me, need to see. Where is it? Sorry, I need to go looking for this because I already took it out of the Landsknecht Cookbook file.
We can circle back to that later.
Yeah, okay. It's Franzberger's 5 Bücher, and it is actually referenced in the. Also, it's not terribly realistic. In reality, the army organization always had officers that were in charge of ensuring that that basics were available: bread, meat, cheese, bacon, the things that the soldiers absolutely needed. Also, things like linen, wool cloth, weapons. These were contracted out well in advance, and if you imagine an army like that, an army of maybe 20, 30,000 people moving across the countryside, and an officer in charge of supplies writing letters to towns and cities in their projected path, informing them. We have some of those letters surviving that the Proviantmeister, that's what his name, his title was, of an army of Emperor Maximilian wrote to towns in southern Germany, advising them, for example, to please tell your shoemakers to produce as many shoes as they possibly can, because in 3 weeks' time, we're coming through with an army of so and so many thousand Landsknechts, and they're going to be needing new shoes. It was a well-established system. It worked as long as the armies moved through Germany. And I cannot begin to imagine what an intelligence treasure trove that must have been. If you actually have to write, I mean, there is this guy and his secretary who writes these letters and who has in his desk the copies of the army's route for the next 1 or 2 months. That must have been worth a fortune to the end. But they did this because there was no way that you could actually supply 20,000 or 30,000 men with just what you found locally. Whenever they tried to do that, organization broke down very quickly and food became very rare. Local governments were roped in to ensure supplies. They got these letters, and I mean, such a letter is always phrased as a polite request, but you just realize that's a polite request backed by 20,000 men with pikes and halberds, and if you don't get them that food that they need, then it's going to get unpleasant. But it's also economic incentive. there's a large amount of economic activity going on, people trying to better themselves, people trying to make investment opportunities and come to these markets. This sounds very theoretical, but we can imagine this at a very basic level. If you are, like this guy, a peddler who is selling odds and ends and is making a meager living walking around the villages and the small fairs selling all these things, he's got knives, mirrors, neck chains, books, playing cards, little inkwell here. A Landsknecht army is an enormously attractive proposition because you've got the population of a middle-sized city, but you don't have the guilds monopolizing its market. The farmers in the surrounding countryside could probably charge a lot of money for their products suddenly. So they would come. They would actually come to the camp market, and they were welcome there. There was specifically a rule in Landsknecht armies that exempted anyone who could carry all that they were selling on their body from market fees. So the idea was specifically to take care of attracting these peasants and peddlers. They were very welcome, but really every supplier was. And of course, an army like that had to move with an enormous supply train. This is you can see this is very high quality 16th century art. This is the Triumph of Emperor Maximilian. It's a set of, I think it's something like 200 woodcuts. You can see a complete set at the British Museum. They have one. And this is the very end of it. This shows the supply train. This is a wagon that is packed high, piled high with all kinds of stuff. Here you can see enormous cauldrons that are meant for suspending over the fire. There is a vat here that you could store cheese in or mix vegetables in. The man in front with those two very long poles over his shoulders is selling shoes. Those are shoes. This is what an army supply train would have looked like. Multiply this by hundreds. These wagons follow the army, which means it's moving at a snail's pace. Everything here is private enterprise. These are not army wagons. They are not soldiers. These people are all there on their own contracts or on their own business. Which doesn't mean that they are not a military asset if they really need to be. The wagons get used for field fortifications, and this guy, as you can see here, is carrying a pretty serious blade, which he probably needs to protect himself as much as anybody else, but still. Okay, so what does the food in the army camp then look like? This is where it gets interesting. We know that professional cooks followed the army. These people were known as Zudler. That is where we get the English word Sudler from. Zudler, by the way, in modern German, we think of Sudeln, besudeln, which means to dirty something. It has nothing to do with dirt. It has to do with broth, with seething, with boiling. Sud is broth, is cooking liquid. These people were urban professionals. They come from a pool of professionals that are established in cities called Garbräter, Garkoch, or just Koch, cooks or roasting cooks. And these people are usually organized in guild structures, and these are often affiliated with butchers. And this is an infuriating thing that is going to happen ever so often. When I talk about the Holy Roman Empire, just about anything in the Holy Roman Empire, you need to realize that I'm really talking about around 400 independent states with its own laws and systems. They were often very similar, but the exact details are never quite the same. These people are important to an army, and we know that from a simple but fascinating thing. When during the German Peasants' War of 1525, several cities in Thuringia declared for the peasant army, that was an awesome thing. Several city councils, under pressure from their armed and rather unhappy population, joined the peasant uprising as political entities. One of the things that they sent to the peasant army, they sent supplies of gunpowder, weapons from their city armories. They sent artillerymen and fencing masters to train the force, and they sent cooks to manage their supplies. Because that's essentially the skill these people had. They are catering professionals. And we know from earlier sources, because up until the end of the 15th century, armies are not supplied on a market basis. We know that, for example, the city of Nuremberg once fed 10,000 soldiers and allies an enormous meal outside of its city gates. And for that purpose, they hired, among others, 20 cooks. That is what they did. You could hire them for festivals, you could hire them for campaigns and for travel. These were professionals in managing food provision under challenging circumstances. That's what they did, cooking for large numbers and cooking under challenging circumstances. That's their job. But not only cooks cooked. Soldiers' wives would prepare foods. This is one of the things that people always, whenever they met armies of German Landsknechts, they always observed every Landsknecht is followed by a woman, a wife, a common law wife. Many contemporaries refer to them as Huren, which is a misleading term because that in modern German means a prostitute, which these women were not, at least most of them were. They were companions of the soldier. They were only as a unit together could they function effectively. The soldier could not manage his own supply needs. He could not cook his own food. He could not carry his own luggage. That's what the common law wife, that's what the Hure did, the camp follower. And here you can see a stereotypical Landsknecht wife with this enormous pack carrying a large frying pan, what looks like a smaller one and probably a cooking spoon here. There's a record from the Ottoman Wars in the 1560s that states that the loads that these women carry are enormous. They would carry spare clothing, cook pots, bedding, a tent harp or shelter, a cushion. They would carry spare shoes. They would carry spare ammunition and parts for the weaponry. And they would be carrying firewood that they picked up along the way, all of it on their backs, together with several days' worth of bread and meat. And they would do this day in, day out. And if you've ever been to India or parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where in traditional societies, women are still expected to do all that labor without the assistance of any modern conveniences, you know that that is completely credible. A more interesting question is the function of the Rotte. Landsknecht armies were self-organizing entities. The soldiers were not assigned to units. The soldiers would form Rotten of 6 to 10 men and elect their own leaders. And it's possible that this Rotte functioned analogous to the mess of the Navy, that they cooked food together, ate food together. We know that in garrisons under siege, a Rotte is issued some of the supplies as a unit. But unfortunately, because all of this is privately organized and there is no official command structure attached, we don't know the details. But it's quite likely that the soldiers organize their own supplies that way. And this is what such a camp looks like, very picturesque here. This is a woodcut showing the siege of Münster. Münster, that's another story, but let's not get into details this much. What matters here is, number one, artists love these scenes because they're so picturesque, they're so beautiful and bucolic, and you can see those Landsknechts hanging around here doing Landsknechty stuff. Those two are gambling. They are rolling dice on the head of a drum. Those are drinking around these enormous beer or wine casks. And over here, you have the Zudler cook and his wife or common law wife or camp follower and his servant preparing roast chicken and enormous cauldrons of what is presumably meat being cooked. And these are ceramic cookpots in which they're probably cooking vegetables or legumes. And here you have frying pans, which they'll probably be using later to prepare all kinds of interesting things. And if you look at the fire here, the clouds of steam and smoke rising up, this is completely unrealistic. If you've ever cooked over an open fire, you know that you don't want it to look like that. But it's got the style that the artist wants to capture. Landsknecht soldiers have style. They always do. They are loud, they are big, they use a lot of firewood because they need a lot of everything. It's the Landsknecht culture that they aspire to live up to because it's what the media tells them a Landsknecht is like. But in technical terms, this camp is not unrealistic. That is probably what the typical setup of a market Zudler looks like. This is where a soldier would go to buy a portion of cooked food. We talked about the burdens of the camp follower. This is a French illustration. It's called La Landsknecht, the Landsknecht woman, showing a camp follower of a German Landsknecht army. The French population generally was not usually very happy with them because these Landsknechts came to France as enemies and were notorious for plundering. You can see here she's carrying a roasting spit on which she stuck some bags. There is a rooster here, which may represent sexual promiscuity. That's what the art historians say, or which may be tonight's dinner. We're not sure. And an interesting detail you can see here is this thing emerging, and the author of one of the most influential histories of Landsknecht pointed out that this is an indication that Landsknecht women were armed with your typical Landsknecht sword. This is the shape and the scabbard of the long sword, he says, that this woman is carrying to defend herself and may have represented a serious addition to the Landsknecht force. I don't buy it, because if you look at the extension of this, you can see that that's actually the handle of the frying pan. The pan is here. She's carrying a frying pan and a roasting spit, a basket of loot, and tonight's dinner. A champion looter, surely. That's the function. Professional cooks would have carried large equipment, heavy cauldrons and standing pots on wagons or on sumpter animals, beasts of burden, because they had the capital to organize that. It was a very capital intensive thing. You couldn't just start being a Zudler cook. You can't just show up knowing how to cook and make a business out of it. You need the equipment. That was the big deal. Almost everybody knew how to cook. You needed the gear and you needed the meat, so you needed capital. They had that. Mostly, they probably carried lighter equipment, not cast metal cooking vessels, but even lighter equipment is only relatively light. I mean, if you can imagine going along any footpath through the forest, through the foothills of anywhere, an Appalachian Trail, a Wanderweg in the German Mittelgebirge, carrying a restaurant frying pan and that looks about ½ an inch thick rod of iron, plus a duffel bag. You're probably not going to be happy to be doing that for long. Landsknecht armies, as far as we can tell, averaged about 5 kilometers a day. That's about 3 miles. Any modern infantryman will laugh at that, but these armies were weighed down by an enormous logistical tail. And if you walk like this, you don't want to be doing more than 3 miles a day. Okay, so let's talk about the things that were possible with this. The pans show up always, again and again. Here we have them again. Notice the difference between the outside and the inside. These pans were probably made of iron. Surviving examples are. They may or may not have been tinned, but they certainly were polished on the inside, if you look at that. So they kept them as clean as they could. These pans were used for deep frying. That's their main purpose. But you can also, they are fairly deep. You can also use them for boiling and for cooking porridges, and even for baking under in an emergency, in a pinch. Then you have ceramic pots. They look like this here. You've seen the bigger ones at the Siege of Münster. These are standard kitchen-sized ones. That's what they typically look like. They have a flat bottom, and then they have these outward bulging walls, and you put them in the embers, you place them by the fire. They are typically used for vegetables, legumes, porridges, or very tough meat. Cauldrons suspended over the fire are used for cooking meats, puddings, and sausages, and spits for roasting. And you had all of that available in camp. You need to realize that that means that you have most of the equipment that your average kitchen would have had. In your urban environment, a city cook would not have had significantly more gear. They were reasonably well equipped. They could make a lot in camp. What we know about the soldiers ate, that's a bit complicated. We have something, I'm quoting this from the 1598 Ordinance of War that is quoted in the diary of Lazarus von Schwendi, which says that a soldier receives 2 pounds of bread, 1.5 pounds of meat, and 2 liters of beer a day. These are approximations. The pound differs from city to city, but we're talking about between 400 and 500 grams typically. And the liter is the mass, which also is anywhere between 900 and 1,200 milliliters. But the rough quantity is there. So we're talking about 2 pounds of bread, 1.5 pounds of meat, and half a gallon of beer, which is rounded out by 2 pounds each of bacon, cheese, and butter every week. Now, the thing is, that's not an issue. That's not a ration that is given out by anybody. There isn't an office or a mess hall that gives the soldiers these. This is what you are supposed to reckon an army needs. This is the stuff that you need to have coming into camp every day. And the actual diet very likely was both a lot more diverse and less ample. A 1573 manual for garrison management, again by Franzberger, by the way, lists supplies that include beans, peas, lentils, oats, barley, oil, bacon, lard, butter, cheese, oil, and dried fish, stockfish, and something called Platteisen. And includes the instruction that if you can get anything other than stockfish, get something other than stockfish, because nobody likes stockfish. That seems to have been a thing in Germany. And spices are also mentioned: cinnamon, pepper, ginger, and nutmeg and mace, but they are mentioned specifically as something that you keep on account of sick men. So nobody actually expected soldiers to be using spices routinely. Most of what the soldiers ate probably was bread. Bread was the basic foodstuff in the cities of Germany, and it was carried over long distances. We have, for example, in the calculations of the Lazarus von Schwendi, who I talked about, the expectation that an army of 10,000 men would keep 1,000 baggage wagons busy simply transporting food, bread to the camp, bread and other foodstuffs to the camp every week or so, with a turnaround time from the city that they got their supplies from. Bread could be carried over longer distances. It kept. It's a 1597 agricultural calendar by Johannes Kohler, a North German Lutheran cleric, who's a really interesting guy. I translated some of his culinary writings for my webpage. He writes that for the servants, it's a really good idea to spend some time in January or February baking bread, because you're not very busy during those months. And after you've baked enough bread in January or February, it should last until Easter. Bread could last very, very well. We also have mentions in our texts of mobile ovens, of improvised flatbreads cooked on stones, and breads cooked on spits. All of that was done because supplying bread to an army on the move is difficult. And soldiers expected bread. Porridge was not good enough. The other thing that soldiers expected was meat. That is something that you find in German culture. Soldiers get meat. As early as the mid-15th century, when you're talking about rations and talking about public meals, soldiers always get meat and ample portions of meat. A regular meat supply was very important. And the Zudler, these butcher cooks that followed the army, usually maintained herds of cattle that followed the army, and they slaughtered them on the day and on the spot. That was a very risky investment, but it could pay off hugely. We know that there were very, very strong price fluctuations, and especially when the army was looting cattle, livestock was the most valuable thing that most peasants owned. And if the army took them away and sold them in camp, soldiers could become very wealthy that way. But the people who would buy them, of course, I mean, your average infantry soldier is not going to actually have any use for an ox. But the Zudler cook will buy it off of him. Will buy it off of him for a lot less than he will sell the bits and pieces for, but still more than the infantry soldier would expect to normally earn. Everybody's happy except for the peasant. We know from fluctuations that a whole cow during the peasant war would go for as much as a 16th part of a guilder, which meant a quarter of an infantry soldier's day's pay, daily pay, which is ridiculously low. Trust me on that. Okay, and what do we do with these animals? There's an interesting source by Meister Hansen, a cook. If you are interested in these sources, by the way, I'll be talking about the German culinary corpus and introduce instructions to various sources tomorrow. Meister Hansen is a cookbook author. Well, he's probably fictitious, but we'll come to that. Records how a crew of cooks would take a single calf and produce roasted and boiled meat, a liver sausage, a brain almond mousse, a blood sausage, a lung pancake, cooked tripe, a galantine, a bread pudding, a blood-based sauce, a broth-based sauce, boiled meatballs, and a soup. In the course of a single afternoon. That is the kind of skill level that you expect of a professional cook. Marx Rumpold, in his 1581 cookbook, lists recipes by animal. So he's basically saying, if you have a cow, these are the things you can make. If you have a chicken, these are the things you can make. For the ox, he lists 83 recipes of what to do with just about every part of the ox. He also has recipes for guinea pig. Max Rumpold is really interesting. Okay. Talking about other things, porridge. This dude here is not a Landsknecht, but the cooking arrangements are interesting. This is actually Joseph. This is a depiction of the birth of Christ. You can see in the back the blankets. The Virgin Mary is propped up in bed holding the infant Jesus, and that is Joseph blowing on the embers of the fire to get the fire going, and he's got a little pan with porridge ahead of him. That is something that you typically cook in single portions. Porridge is your standard individual dish. And it must have played a much bigger role than the records tell us. There's simply no way that it didn't. We know that it did in private life. We know that it did in all other contexts. There's no way that of all the people in Germany, Landsknecht soldiers didn't eat porridge. They may have hated it though. There was a significant stigma to eating porridge. Poor people ate porridge. A soldier was not a poor person. Then there's another thing. We straight up do not know if Landsknecht soldiers observed fast days. We don't. There's some indication that they did. We're not quite sure, but we don't know. Sorry, I can't. I think there were just a few questions, and I can't catch the chat function right now. All right. Okay.
Let me relay the questions that have
Yes, that would be helpful.
I didn't want to interrupt your flow because that didn't work last time. Some people wanted to know about a little more about the bread. Is that like hardtack or a flat bread, or how did that come out in those shallow pans?
Both hardtack and flatbread existed, but they were both considered stopgap measures. What you want is bread baked in proper ovens, leavened sourdough bread. It would have had a very thick, hard crust, and it would have been very designed to last for a long time, but it was what we would consider proper bread. There's an interesting source reference. I also worked on that in my book from the Deutsche Speiskammer by Hieronymus Bock, Hieronymus Tragus, a botanist, who writes that if you want to know how to cook flatbread on hot stones, you need to ask soldiers. They know that kind of thing. And he adds, when, not if. When you are driven from your home and become a refugee, this is useful knowledge. He grew up in uncertain times. Hardtack existed. We have several recipes surviving. Franzberger calls it chip bread. He says that this is the kind of bread that you eat when you go on naval expeditions, but you shouldn't really, it's not what you expect on land. Like I said again, Landsknechts are demanding eaters. Once the 17th century rolls around, hardtack becomes standard military rations. But the Landsknechte were not happy with it. So getting back to this, we don't know if they observed fast days, but it's likely that some of them at least did. We know that they ate dairy, they did eat eggs, that they obtained seasonal fruit locally. And we know that they enjoyed fried foods and that those were probably somewhat luxury items. This lower image here, that's actually a woman baking waffles. This is from Peter Bruegel's Battle of Carnival and Lent. She is fighting on the side of Carnival, making a waffle batter and cooking it in a waffle iron. And if you look at the equipment she's got a bowl, she's got a waffle iron, she's got a knife, she's got some fire, she's got some butter here. That's about it. You could do this in an army camp. There's absolutely no reason why this wouldn't have happened. We don't have evidence, but that's because we don't have a lot of evidence about the details. Nobody wrote it down. Beer and wine were centrally important to the supply, and though they were mostly obtained locally, transporting them was an enormous challenge. I mean, look at the size of this vat, and this is not an unrealistic size. We have surviving casks in that size. But you realize that thing literally does weigh a ton, a metric ton. How do you move, how do you manhandle a metric ton of something that if you drop it, will break and spill something, an investment worth the equivalent of tens of thousands of dollars modernly? That's challenging, that's professional work, and that was done.
Are we brewing on the road? No
way. That would not have been possible. No. We are carrying brews from local suppliers, and since brewing was going on everywhere, that was not, we're not talking about long distances, but there is no way that the soldiers made their own brews. That did not happen. We know that they did this in garrisons and in siege situations, but not in an army camp. They neither had the equipment nor the time, because that takes at least a few days. But there was an enormous and lively trade in wine and beer and brandwein, distilled liquors, which were just now becoming a common enough beverage. Lazarus von Schwendi at the end of the 16th century basically says that if you want to reduce casualties, ban your soldiers from drinking distilled liquor, because that kills more of them than the enemy ever will. He was not successful, and no army commander ever managed to ban brandwein from a Landsknecht camp. How do we know all this stuff? Because like I said, nobody wrote down an army cookbook. There is no ration lists. We have to rely on a lot of disparate sources. We have military manuals that tell us about siege situations, about garrison victualling. We have household records, and we're not just talking about individual homes, we're talking about noble households and courts. We have account books of armies and governments. We have recipe collections. They are actually valuable sometimes, but you have to be used with care. We have personal accounts. These are rare in the 16th century, but we do have them. We have popular literature and, interestingly, songs. We have quite a lot of songs dealing with Landsknecht life. Of course, this is a bit perilous. If you try to imagine trying to reconstruct the life of the average American motorcycle enthusiast from the popular songs of the 1960s and 1970s, you may arrive at a somewhat rosy picture. The Landsknecht songs are probably very, very similar. They were not, I mean, it's tempting to think that this is the stuff that the Landsknecht sang around the campfire, but this is actually the stuff that printers in urban business decided to publish for the consumption of an urban readership about Landsknecht. So there are several mental filters set in. Still, they are one of our best sources for what Landsknechts hoped to get in life. Now, a problem with recipes, and that is what I had to go back to for most of my cookbook at the end, is specific. Recipe collections tend to be marketed to upper classes. They are a printer's business or a copyist's, a hand manuscript writer's business. So either somebody commissions them specifically, or somebody makes them for their own use and invests a lot in ink and labor and paper and leather, or somebody prints them for sale. And a lot of German cookbooks, especially in the second half of the 16th century, are enormous and very richly decorated and hugely expensive. These things are not what you'd expect your average household to have. They also assume very much. Most recipes simply go on the assumption that they don't need to tell you how to do certain things. For example, we have no recipe for something called Eirenschmalz, which is basically fried eggs. And we have just every recipe collection we have has at least one recipe for baked marzipan. Baked marzipan is a luxury food. It's probably about as common in 16th century Germany as caviar is in 21st century America. As in, we all know somebody who's eaten it. We all know that somebody is eating it right now. We've probably all tasted it at some point, but it's definitely not something we eat a lot. Eirenschmalz, fried egg, was something that people ate every day, but we have no recipes because everybody knew how to do it. So what I tried to do for this book was I looked at the recipes that survived and I looked at the other sources and cross-referenced them. What do we know that they ate? What do we know that they had? What kind of foods are mentioned? And then you look at also at mock recipes. That is an interesting source. A lot of the time, cookbooks will tell you how to produce something that looks like something else, that looks like a common blood sausage, a green sausage, looks like black bread. And that gives you an idea of what you're aiming for. Of course, the mock recipe would most of the time be for Lent and then produce it from something completely different. You can also just subtract status ingredients. Very often, cookbooks will include 2 or 3 recipes that actually are credible for everyday food, but will then add things like ginger, sugar, saffron. If you take them out, these are reasonably common. You look at equipment, you look at non-recipe sources to cross-reference, and you look for the rare recipe in the cookbooks that is actually referenced as something that poor people eat, that soldiers eat, that peasants eat. They do exist. There's not a lot of them, but they do exist. Okay, now let's talk about some specific recipes from the book. That question? No question? Okay.
Please mute your microphones.
Okay. Now, one of the most common foods that we know is referenced in all kinds of situations is soup. Soup is ubiquitous. Everybody eats soup, and soup at the point basically refers to some liquid food that is poured over bread, and then you eat the two things together. It's ubiquitous, but recipes are quite rare, and it takes a lot of conjecturing. I found recipes for a mushroom soup, a cheese soup, a pea soup, and a cabbage soup, and a root vegetable soup, and I included several in the book. Basic broth, the most common kind of soup, was probably just the cooking liquid ladled over bread. But we don't have a recipe for that. None survive. Here we have, this is a page from the provisional layout from the cookbook. So that's what the actual cookbook's going to look like. Cheese soup. Cheese soup was very popular and probably commonly eaten. We have a total of 2 surviving recipes, but numerous references in other parts of literature talking about how this is a welcome thing, how you would eat this, how poor people eat this, and so on. This is what the text that survives looks like. It's from the Kloster Kochbuch, and again, I refer you to tomorrow's talk if you want to know more details about the Kloster Kochbuch. The Kloster Kochbuch is a horror. It's a horrible story. Everything that could possibly go wrong with a source has gone wrong in the transmission of this source, and we can't fix it because of World War II. But it is still, for so many recipes, our only go-to source because it is the one we have. It's horrible. When we lost that, we probably lost an entire branch of our recipe tradition, and we may yet have a chance of recovering it, but I'll get into that detail. Here we have what passes for the recipe. You pass out cheeses, wash them clean in pure warm water, cut them up small, put them into a pot, and set them by the fire with water. You throw in peeled onions, green parsley, the herb and root, and sage leaves. And you let that boil well and take care that it does not burn. That's actually important because the cheese tends to sink to the bottom, and if you're working with fire, that's pretty hot. When it is boiled, that is when it is done, again, you're expected to know when it is done, pass it through a sieve or cloth and put it back in a clean pot. Make it fat with butter, strew whole caraway on it, and salt it and serve it. You can reconstruct something from this. This is actually a fairly extensive and clear recipe. And I did. I made a version that actually works. It's not the only version, but it works. And if you use a full-fat, reasonably easy to melt cheese, you can arrive at something that's very tasty. If you want to have it easy, you just use processed American cheese, but don't blame me for the flavor you're going to get. You're not going to like it with processed cheese, but it works at charm. You can make it in large quantities. As an aside, cheeses here is the plural in the original, which indicates that we're talking about not very old cheese, because really aged cheese comes in large wheels in the 16th century, not very old cheese, reasonably young cheese, cheese that is like our young Gouda or young cheddar, comes in smaller cheese wheels, smaller loaves, pieces. And if you use several of them for a cauldron of soup, then yes, you're not talking about old, high status cheeses. Okay, another thing, boiled meat. Meat was probably roasted, but more often boiled. And again, we have very, very few instances of instructions of any kind for doing that. Again, this is, by the way, this is a photo from the food photography of the book. And as you can see, they did their level best. They have a piece of roast here. They have a piece of the bread pudding here that I also include in the book. These are 2 pewter plates, and here's a horn cup and pottery cup overflowing with foaming beer, which is realistic. This is actually what a Landsknecht set table could have looked like. Of course, not in camp, but in quarters, or maybe at an officer's table. And Some of the gear actually was supplied by me. The pewter plates and the horn cup, I supplied those to the food photographer because I was so disgusted with some of the equipment that they came up for the first photographs. And of course, because this is a professional food photographer, he had to put a bloody 19th century serving fork here. Because you can't have a single picture of food photography for a historic cookbook without one glaring error. I am sorry, but that is how they all go. There's good stuff on there. There's really useful pointers, and then every single one of them has one glaring error. That it's almost as though they instructed him to put it there. They didn't. It's just that it was coronavirus, so I couldn't just go over and be there for the photo session. It was taking place in another city anyway. Okay, so some of the things, it's more likely more meat was boiled than roasted, and it was boiled very, very fresh, which is actually a good thing to do. Most meat that you buy from the butchers today is aged at least for several days. You don't want that if you boil it. Boiled meat that you boil completely fresh really turns out great, but it's not going to be easy to do unless you do your own slaughtering. And the recipes need to be reconstructed from a variety of sources because, again, there is no recipe that instructs you how to boil meat. Same problem with roasting. Chickens are a very common food. They show up in the songs. Landsknechts sing about, we talked about the songs, right, as a source, but Landsknecht songs sing about chicken, roast chicken. They are like the dream food of the successful Landsknecht, the food that is aspirational. We know that there is a distinction between Italian style, Welche Art, and German style, Deutsche Art of preparing chicken. And as far as I can tell from looking at several sources, Welche Art, the Italian style, means that they are stuffed with herbs, fresh herbs. Deutsche Art, the German style, means that they are stuffed with boiled eggs and their own innards. That you take out the organ meats, you clean them, you cook them, you mash them with boiled eggs and sometimes with fruit or vegetables, and you put them back inside the body cavity. As an aside, and just out of interest, there is an actual 8th century source, a medicinal recipe collection, the Lorsche Arzneibuch, that refers to boiled eggs, hard-boiled eggs, as suitable fillings for birds. So this could go back one hell of a long way. But this is what we're talking about, the 16th century now. Chicken is also used as an ingredient in dishes, in pastries and pies and so on. But chicken was extremely popular. And you can see why. You don't need to be a professional. Yeah? You don't need logistics. If you plunder a farm and you find an ox, well, you need to convince that ox to come along with you because you can't just carry it on your back. You need to find somebody who can process that ox for you. You probably end up selling it to a Zudler cook and then spend the money over the next few days for a couple of pieces of that ox cooked. You don't need any of that for a chicken. You can carry the chicken on your own back. You can process the chicken in your own camp. You can kill it and pluck it and cook it. And you can do all of this on your own. That is why the chicken is really the perfect Landsknecht loot. And chickens would have been widely available. Still, it is very unlikely that chickens were frequently, simply because an army of 20,000 people is not going to move through a region of 20,000 chickens every day. But we have a lot of interesting recipes. This is one of my favorites. And I am absolutely certain that there is a commonplace version of this. This is an upscale version from a manuscript cookbook. It is chicken boiled with lettuce and parsley roots. And using lettuce like spinach actually works shockingly well. But it suggests that there's a much more commonplace version with cabbages or other greens, garden greens. And I tried that and it works. You can take an old chicken, an old hen, and boil it with cabbage and root vegetables, and it makes a very satisfying dish. I do highly recommend it. And I'm absolutely sure that the Landsknechts did this because, again, people kept chickens for eggs, which means that if you go into a farm and you steal the first chicken that you're going to find, you've probably got something on your head that you can roast on your spit till it's black and it's not going to turn out juicy and plump and flavorful like modern fried chicken. This is the recipe. It's from Sabina Welser's cookbook. If you would make chickens in lettuce, take a pot and lay in a handful of lettuce leaves and place a chicken on that. Again, a handful of lettuce and again, a chicken on top and so forth. Then take good meat broth, that's fat, and add a good lump of butter. Salt it and boil it until it has boiled enough. Again, you know that kind of stuff, right? You can tell when it is boiling. Add a little mace. And you must take the lettuce and wash it thoroughly beforehand. That is how it is. Again, these are very useful instructions. And if you tweak them a little bit, you probably don't have the mace. You may not have fat meat broth. And you're probably not going to be using lettuce. Probably going to be using something more basic like chard leaves or cabbage, summer cabbage or something like that. You've got an absolutely credible thing to make with chicken. Another dish, leeks in milk. This is a lovely find. Just about every other German cookbook has a recipe or a mention for cooking leeks in almond milk. Either with or without bread. Leeks cooked in almond milk, you show up every time. The problem, of course, is that to make almond milk, you need a mortar, you need access to clean water, you need a sieve or a straining cloth, you need a lot of time, and you need almonds. Almonds are expensive. They don't grow in most of Germany. They're an imported luxury. And what I found, was there was this one recipe that says, but you can also use regular milk. I'm pretty much absolutely sure that's what most people did, with or without the recipe writer's permission. Almond milk is a substitute that is used for Lent when milk is forbidden, and a status marker that is used to show that you can afford it. Most people would have used milk. And as a green dish with milk and bread thickening for the sauce, again, this is completely credible as a side dish for a normal table. Oh, did I mention the obligatory error? Look at that cup here. Yikes. Okay. Another thing that is extremely common in the German corpus is fritters, deep fried foods. We joke about this, saying that if an American food must have significant roots in German cooking because they fry so much. And yes, Renaissance Germans deep fry everything. There is a cookbook, and not a terribly successful or good one, by some Franz de Roncier that's published in 1598, I think, the 1590s anyway. He gives the most cursory, brief recipes. It's not a very useful source, but he has so many of them. At one point, he provides one recipe for a dipping batter, and then he proceeds to give a list of all the things we dip in batter and deep fry. The list is 3 pages long. The Germans loved fritters. Every cookbook has fritter recipes. Most of them consist of almost only fritter recipes. Your basic fritters are so common, they're called Strauben. Your basic fritters are so common that the batter is used as a reference point. Very frequently, a recipe will instruct you to make something as thick as a Strauben batter. Again, no actual recipes for Strauben are found in most of those cookbooks because people know how to make them. Fritters are often enriched with cheese or filled. Here we have a set of 3 kinds of fritters that I made for an experimental dinner with friends. Here in the back, these are what we call flädlein or flädlein. These are small flat cakes with a meat filling, and they are deep fried. Over here you have cheese fritters, Parmesan balls, and these here are angestrichens. They are also enriched with cheese. Cheese is a very common ingredient. Deep fried, and in this case served with a raspberry sauce. Raspberry sauce is my absolute favorite from the German sauces. I have not found it in any other place. I have found several references to it in the German corpus. I've not found it in Italy, in the Netherlands, in England, in France. It seems to be a German thing, literally. And now consider, you make it from raspberries. Raspberries are a seasonal foraged fruit in the 16th century. So this would have been available for maybe 4 weeks out of the year maximum. A very seasonal delight. People must have looked forward to this. Here we have it. Today, of course, we can just buy frozen raspberries. We can have it all year round, which kind of makes it more boring. But yes, here's an example for one of those recipes. Fritters as crooked as horseshoes. You grate good cheese and you take with it half as much flour and break eggs into it so you can knead it, and spices. You roll it out on a bench. Bench means any work surface, yeah, your tabletop, so that it becomes like a sausage. So roll it out, then make it crooked and fry it in fat. This is actually a useful recipe, and it is one that comes up again and again. It's your typical thing: cheese, egg, flour, deep fry. I am absolutely convinced that this kind of fritter was very, very common. We have reference to it being served with fruit sauces. We do not have a lot of reference to spices. So when the Inntal Kochbuch, that's the one I took it from, because this is the only one that actually gives you proportions. Half as much flour as cheese. It mentions spices. Most of them don't. It doesn't tell you which spices, because again, obviously, you're a cook, you would know that kind of thing. And Krapfen, filled fritters, another perpetual favorite of Germany, and another thing that I'm absolutely convinced Landsknecht would have enjoyed, because they are easy to make with fairly basic equipment from whatever you have on hand. You make a dough, leavened in some way, you wrap things in it, you deep fry the whole thing. They're enormously satisfying, they're very tasty, they're easy to make. I am convinced, yeah? You may or may not be, I am. And then pies. I included several pie and tart recipes in the Landsknecht Cookbook, specifically with a view to them being class markers. These are not the ones that are included in the Landsknecht Cookbook. These are a selection of pies from a dinner that I made in 2020 for a couple of friends in Vielburgen in southern Germany, from late 16th century recipe sources. They're contemporaneous, but they are much more luxurious. This is peach pies after Anna Becker, and these are strawberry and red currant pies after Anna Becker. And these are really interesting because you put strawberries into a custard and you bake them like that. That's an awful lot like German Erdbeerkuchen. If you look at those more closely, and I think we have the time for this, there's a cautionary tale in there. You can't actually eat these pies except with a spoon, because I used modern strawberries. They're the only strawberries I have. They are American strawberries. They are cultivated forms of the Virginian strawberry. The Virginian strawberry is a fairly large aromatic fruit. But when a 16th century German cookbook talks about strawberries, they're talking about the forest strawberry, which is about the size of a currant. If you put those in the custard and bake it, you get a wonderfully delicious pie. But if you use those big strawberries, those American-style strawberries, they sweat out so much water that you get a perfectly delightful pudding, which you can eat with a spoon. So much for the cautionary tale about modern ingredients. You figure this out as you go along. But getting back to class markers, there's a very simple reason for this. To bake a pastry, to bake a pie or a tart, you need a baking facility. The baking facility of choice was the Pastetenpfanne. You get this described in a number of sources, and I give you a description in the Landsknecht Cookbook. It was basically, it functioned like a Dutch oven. You had coals underneath, you had coals or embers heaped at the top, and you baked inside it. And that was how you did it, because even reasonably wealthy urban households often didn't have their own baking ovens. So you couldn't just turn on the oven and bake a pastry, but that you could do. These pastry baking pans would have substituted for baking ovens if you wanted to make any small baked goods in camp. But of course, to have them, you needed luggage space. And the only people who had that kind of luggage space, other than maybe some very enterprising Zoodler cooks, were officers. Officers were assigned, again, we have these pay scales, we have these books. An officer was assigned pay and a retinue. And the retinue of every officer upwards of Hauptmann, ranks don't translate exactly, but a Hauptmann commands a unit of several hundred men. Every officer upwards of Hauptmann is assigned a personal cook. And of course, a personal cook of an officer who has a whole luggage wagon to himself would easily carry a pastry pan. So an officer would be able to serve pastries, which common soldiers will not. So here we have a very likely marker of class distinction in a Landsknecht army. Recipes for pies and pastries abound. They range from basic to highly complex. And this is the time when German cuisine really discovers pastries. All of European cuisine, but German cuisine too. I'm absolutely fascinated with it. You find recipes for several kinds of crusts, really interesting stuff. Again, short reference to this, I am currently finishing a translation of the Kuchenmeisterei, which is the first printed cookbook in German, which will be out this year from Ellipsis Imprints. And that has a really interesting recipe set of recipes for pastries where you make a short crust by first making an egg crust and then making it, soaking it in melted butter while it bakes. I've tried it. It works, but it's really difficult. Okay, here's a recipe for an almond tart, which is high status any way you slice it. If you want to make an almond tart, take the whites of eggs and a little grated bread. A little grated bread is interesting. The fewer almonds you have, the more grated bread you use. That's what it does. It fills it out. Yeah. Take almonds, grind them up small, and add rose or lavender water. Add these to the eggs. Add sugar. Make a bottom crust as for a tart. This is simple. This is one of the simpler recipes for almond tart. We have loads of them. Several parallels alone in recipes in recipe collections from the same place as this one. This is from the recipe manuscript of Maria Stenglerin, who was a member of an Augsburg patrician family. We know very little about her, and even less about the origins of her book, which is really unfortunate. But in the same half of the 16th century, the city of Augsburg produced two manuscript recipe collections for upper class women that are both edited and that are both really interesting. This is an interpretation of one of those almond tarts with a covering from Anna Wecker. Anna Wecker describes beating egg whites, mixing them with sugar syrup, and putting them on top of the tart as it bakes. So this is basically almond meringue pie. And it's good. It really is good. completely credible as a status show. If you put this on your table, again, completely ignore the background. This was made experimentally with a friend whose China is distinctly not 16th century. If you put this on the table in an army camp, you're going to wow people. Okay, here's a simpler one from the Innsbruck manuscript. That's 15th century. If you want to make a tart, take chard, salt, and parsley. Chop it up small and wash it in fresh water. Grate cheese into it, add fat and eggs, and then make sheets of dough and fill it into them. Bake it in a pan. They mean a baking pan, a passetenpfanne. And put egg yolk on top. And leave it to bake well. That one's actually good. It's a standard version of your green tart. You have them in Italian corpus, you have them in the French corpus and the English corpus. They are a European phenomenon. This is a fairly early one. And this one is unusual in that it uses chard and parsley. Typically, it uses spinach. Spinach has a higher status than chard. Below chard, you would still have cabbage. We know from the late 16th century that cabbage tarts were a thing. We don't know how far back they go. I did not conjecture a cabbage tart for an officer's table. I went with chard and spinach, but feel free to go with cabbage. It works. This is what an experimental version looked like. You brush it with egg yolks. It gives it this beautiful Maillard color. You don't actually put the egg yolk in. Again, we also don't know what kind of cheese. Feel free to experiment. I'm very fond of an aged Gouda, but Parmesan works. And interestingly enough, for a totally different flavor profile, so does fresh cottage cheese or Quark. We don't know. Okay. I also wrote a little bit about table manners and why the Landsknechts probably didn't have any. German table manners of the 16th century have a horrible reputation. That's largely because there was a very popular genre of poetry that described bad behavior, grobianische Tischzucht. And for some reason, antiquarian scholars of the 18th and 19th century took them seriously. They said, oh my God, look at this. That is how they ate. No, it isn't. We have actual books of table manners from the time, and we know how people ate, and it's really not that different from the Middle Ages. The standards are standard, but, and here's the interesting point, those manuals address urban audiences, bourgeois audiences. That is who buys them. What we do not have is what we do have in the 12th and 13th century, manuals of table manners that address the nobility. We have those in England, we have them in France, we have them in Italy, we have them in the Netherlands. We don't have them in Germany. I have a theory. It's because the German nobility isn't mediatized. These people actually rule their lands the way that the French nobility, the English nobility, the Italian nobility don't. A French nobleman, an English courtier, an Italian cortigiano is working in a highly socially controlled environment, and advancement is by standing, by regard, by the respect of your fellows. A German nobleman operates in an entirely different environment. He is a law unto himself, and he needs to show that he can break rules with impunity. And oh, did they ever. We have sources. There's a story about a Venetian ambassador to the Diet of Worms in 1525, who's basically writing back to the Signoria in tears that you can't get anything done. At breakfast, these people spit cherry pits at each other. They regularly get into fights. And by noon, they are so drunk you can't have a reasonable conversation. Please send me home. Now, Landsknecht soldiers are the epitome of that attitude. The biggest appeal to being a Landsknecht was literally that you were absolved from the rules of society for proper decorum and dress, that sumptuary laws don't apply to the Landsknecht soldier. rules of bans on bearing arms don't apply to them. Good luck trying to enforce drinking bans and noise ordinances and stuff like that. And those guys, it is highly unlikely that they ever observe bourgeois table manners. The problem is, we know that a Landsknecht army is a highly regulated place with its own rules. And I am pretty sure that they had certain rules of the table that you did not break. We just don't know what they are. And that is something that I haven't been able to crack yet. Just don't expect conventional good bourgeois manners from the Landsknechts. You would not get that. Okay. So the end of the Landsknechts. All good things must come to an end. The Landsknechts were a formidable fighting force in the years between the 1485 and 1560, thereabouts. Following the mid-century Schmalkalden Wars, the last religious war on the soil of the Holy Roman Empire, Germany saw a period of relative peace. The 1570s, 1580s, 1590s, 1600s were a time where nobody wanted to upset the apple cart because the system kind of worked for everybody. There were still Ottoman wars, but they were not at the same intensity as, for example, 1528. There were still rebellions, but nothing on the scale of the peasant uprising. There were still wars in France and Italy, but nothing on the scale when the 1520s, when Landsknecht armies had captured the King of France and sacked the Vatican. I mean, if you go to St. Peter's today, they can still show you where Landsknechts put graffiti on Raphael. Yeah, there's a fresco by Raphael with a graffiti that a Landsknecht put on there during the sack of Rome. That's what that ended. The opportunities for advancement through war were limited. Wars were becoming rarer. And when war returns in 1618 with the 30 Years' War, it becomes very quickly evident that the traditional recruitment system of the Landsknecht army just doesn't work with the modern warfare of the shot and pike era. You have a very brief last hurrah in the first phases of the war, the Bohemian campaign, the Saxon campaign, the Danish campaign, and then the Swedish army, which is actually a modern army with a centralized supply system and a regular regimental system and all, lands on the Baltic shore, wipes the floor with the Landsknecht armies, marches uncontested all the way to Bavaria. That's it. No more Landsknechts after that. By the mid-17th century, armies in Germany operate centralized supply systems, and nobody wants to be a soldier. That is one of the things you simply have to realize, that in 1550, being a Landsknecht soldier is aspirational. Young boys in the cities will talk to you about how they want to go away and become soldiers and how they wish a war would break out. By 1650, 1750, boys in the cities will hide in the attic when the recruitment sergeants come around. Nobody wants to be a soldier in a centralized army. Go. Do we have questions?
Of course, there were tons of questions while you were talking. Now?
Right, go ahead. We still have a couple minutes.
A while back, someone asked about children in the camp followers group. They're probably children happened.
Probably children happened. We know that soldiers had children in camp. We know that camp followers had children in camp. Soldiers were the recognized fathers. There is a rule, a relatively complex rule, which says that if a soldier dies on campaign, the commanding officer will take care to take his worldly estate and transfer it home to his wife, unless he has a camp follower in camp who has a child, in which case she becomes his heir. If the camp follower does not have a child, it doesn't count. That's a very robust hands-on approach to this. However, we'd have to recognize that really a baby born on campaign was probably going to die. There's just no way around that. This is not a safe environment for a young child. Children also, older children also followed the armies. We were talking about the basic logistical unit of the soldier and his common law wife. In many cases, it's the soldier, his boy servant, and his common law wife. In many cases, a Landsknecht would have a boy following him, serving him, and doing menial services, and growing up to learn the trade of a Landsknecht that way. Other questions?
Volker, Paula is asking, what source does that come from, please, about the widowed camp followers?
I don't actually remember. I would have to get back to you. It's an ordinance of war that is quoted in Landsknechte, in Lawrence's Landsknechte. But I don't remember where it comes from exactly. Just a moment. I know the book that it's quoted in, if that helps any. It's from Reinhard Baumann, Landsknechte, Munich, 1994. But it's a German book. And I would have to look up the actual source of this. I don't remember it off the top of my head. Just a moment.
Volker, do you want me to private message her your email address for that reference?
Yes, please.
No problem.
Okay. And other questions?
I'm looking up the address to order the book in German.
Just a moment.
I'll take care of it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, you can get it through the publisher, Zauberfeder Verlag, directly.
Got it.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you mentioned making the green tart and using chard or whatever. Would they have done a lot of gathering along the way of herbs and that sort of thing and use some of that, like dandelion greens or such? Thank you.
Probably not. Simply because an army of 10,000 people is going to run out of dandelion greens very quickly. They would have had a fairly sophisticated understanding of gathering and foraging and what you could eat. These people come from an environment where almost everybody has that knowledge. But the army on the march is moving very slowly and it's moving a lot of people through the territory. It's going to basically strip it bare very quickly. I'm fairly sure that the diet of the average Landsknecht consisted almost entirely of commercially bought or looted foods, simply because that is what you had in the requisite quantities. Landsknechte moving through the countryside on their own after the end of the war or on their way to a muster would have foraged extensively. They knew how to. Almost everybody did.
A question. Volker?
Yes?
What is the youngest age of a land singer? I may be mispronouncing it.
But the youngest age at which a Landsknecht could be recruited?
Yes.
There is no cutoff point, but the recruiter's manuals, Franzberger, for example, is very clear on the fact that he wants men, not boys. Legally, you would be a man from about the age of 14, but socially, you would be expected to be a fully grown adult man from about age 20. The ideal age for a soldier in the 16th century literature, in life cycle literature and such, is between 20 and 30. So that is who you want. We know that many Landsknechts were older than this. We can surmise that many were younger than this. But if a recruiting officer had a choice of men, which he often did, he would take people in that age bracket. Other questions?
Volker, there's a few of them in the chat window for you.
Yeah, just a moment. I'll try and open that. Yes. Okay. Okay.
One from Brittany,
the other
and then one
Franzberger
earlier
book.
from Paula.
Okay. Have I read the other Franzberger books? I am in the process of doing that. The Kriegsordnung is exactly the one I'm reading right now. A Hauptmann, as well as those officers ranking above him, could be assigned a cook. Would you think those officers might use spices more than an average soldier? Absolutely. These soldiers would have, these officers would have belonged to the class that bought cookbooks. These are the people who expect to live like that, expect to work, expect to eat like the cookbooks describe. So yes, and they would probably have carried their own personal supplies of spices, sugar, dried fruit, almonds, and all that. For an officer, especially a high-ranking officer, you can just go to the German cookbook corpus and cook right out of Steindl, out of Wecker, out of Rumpold, and that'll be accurate. A Pipkin from Gwen the Potter. Pans, yes, the clay pots. I'm pretty sure that, yes, I'm pretty sure she could. Those clay pots are a wonderful resource. I've used a recipe, I've used a museum replica of such a cookbook for a cookpot for a very long time until I mailed it to the food photographer and it broke in the mail. I haven't been able to get it back yet, but they are very useful. Okay.
We were having a little debate because maybe we weren't paying good enough attention.
Yes.
But the meringue on top of the almond tart, which cookbook was that from?
That was from Anna Wecker.
Great, thank you.
That, by the way, is the one I'd be translating next. I'm currently working on about 30% done.
Wonderful. I've been following your translations. You're a fabulous resource.
Thank you. Okay, one more thing about the Landsknecht Cookbook. The publisher, because they were very, very worried about rising printing costs and the venture into the American market, decided to go with a Kickstarter where part of the stretch goals were adding 5 extra recipes to the English book, which we met. All the 5 extra recipes are in. And part of it was some extra features to the book with varnishing, 2 fabric bookmarks, colored edging, and so on and so forth. And since the Kickstarter ended, I've had questions from a couple of people whether it is possible to still get the Kickstarter books with the extra features. The regular book that goes on sale in May will have the extra recipes, but it won't have the edging, the varnishing, and the twin fabric bookmarks. Yes, it is. Just got this from the publisher. It's possible still until the 20th of March to get a copy of the Kickstarter edition. And this is how. All right.
There's one last question from Charity Clark.
Regional influences on the food of the armies as they traveled around. No, our sources just aren't good enough, aren't detailed enough for that. We can be pretty sure that there were regional influences. I am very, very certain that especially army cooks would have moved around. Cooks generally moved around. We know that. Cooks accompanied people, rich people on travel. They accompanied soldiers on campaign. It was part of their job. They would have learned from each other. They would have learned from countries that they went to. So yeah, absolutely. But specifically for military campaigns, We do not have any evidence that I know of. I'm looking. There are a couple of anecdotal stories about, for example, soldiers from the Ottoman Wars would bring back baklava and turn it into puff pastry. I'm not convinced that that is where we get puff pastry, but it's possible. I just haven't seen any firm link. I think it's speculation. All right. Are there any other questions or requests? If you want to know more about the sources, tune in tomorrow when I'll be talking about the German recipe corpus and the various sources that I've used and not used for the Landsknecht Cookbook. It's absolutely fascinating. There is such a wealth of sources in German. It's actually speculated now, for reasons that I'll get into, that the largest number of culinary sources before 1600 in any European language is in German. I haven't done the numbers, but we know of the existence of over 60 recipe collections, discrete recipe collections, not copies, in German from before 1600. That's quite a lot. All right. Okay, then I think that's it. And yeah, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, I look forward to seeing some of you again tomorrow.
Thank you very much. Recording is ending now.